Hey everyone, welcome to our webinar on Canada's 2020 Global AIDS Monitoring Report. Thank you all so much for joining us, and to anyone who's watching later on, thank you for watching. My name is Shayna Buehler and I am a Senior Program Officer at the Interagency Coalition on AIDS and Development, or ICAD. We have participants online from across the country, but I am joining you from my home in Ottawa, where I live on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So why are we holding this webinar today? ICAD has been contracted by the Public Health Agency of Canada to engage Canadian civil society in the development of the Global AIDS Monitoring Report, or the GAM report. As part of the process, we have engaged a national steering committee to provide input on the survey design, analysis, and final report. And we've also engaged San Patton, who is here on the line today, to work with us on this process. In addition to this webinar, we will host a second that is currently planned for March 25th at the same time to share the report. So we hope that you will all be able to join us for that as well. The purpose of these webinars is to profile the importance of the GAM report and the role of civil society, and to raise awareness about the process with the view to encouraging higher rates of participation. And finally, the process involves the delivery and the analysis of the survey that I've mentioned, and we'll talk about that more towards the second half of today's session. For today's webinar, Robin Montgomery, ICAD's Executive Director, will start us off with some of the background and context setting, highlighting the significance of the GAM report and linking it to Canada's commitment under the 2016 United Nations Political Declaration on Ending AIDS and the role of civil society in this process. So, for the webinar today, Robin will start us off with some background and context setting, highlighting the significance of the Global AIDS Monitoring Report and linking it to Canada's commitment under the 2016 United Nations Political Declaration on Ending AIDS and the role of civil society in this process. And then I will launch into an overview of the survey for civil society, and that will include asking you for your input on some additional questions that we might include, and we'll finish off with next steps and time for questions. That said, please feel free to jump in with questions at any time. You can just unmute yourself or put a question in the chat box. And with that, I will hand it over to Robin.
Great. Thank you so much, Shayna. So for those of you who are watching or who are joining us today, my name is Robin Montgomery, and I'm the Executive Director of the Interagency Coalition on AIDS and Development. I'm also the board member to the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, and the chair of the implementer group to the board of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. And I've been very involved in the discussions around the development of the next UNAIDS strategy, global AIDS strategy. So this is coming at a really timely moment. So as many of us remember, and we're closely involved in June of 2016, the UN member states adopted something called the Political Declaration on HIV and AIDS. And its subtext was on the fast track to accelerate the fight against HIV to end the AIDS epidemic by 2030. Quite a mouthful. So as an abbreviation, we've referred to it as the 2016 Political Declaration. And you can see it here up on the slide, and it's readily available on the UNAIDS website. Paragraph 76 of the declaration, well into the document, states that member state countries have agreed to provide the General Assembly an annual report on progress achieved in realizing the commitments made in the present declaration. So essentially meaning that we're holding each and every member state, and each and every member state who has endorsed this declaration, holding them accountable by annual reporting. So the reported data are used for national level and regional reviews, as well as global analysis that is presented by UNAIDS through a number of its different reports, including its annual report around World AIDS Day on December 1st. The reporting tool has been designed with the intent to identify the challenges and constraints that countries are confronting or facing, and recommended action to help achieve and accelerate the achievement of the different targets that are outlined in this 2016 political declaration. So as we know, throughout all of this, community and civil society engagement in the governance processes of all of the important multilateral institutions, such as the UN structure, is absolutely critical to this process. Not only in terms of contributing to the governance of the UN Joint Program on HIV and AIDS, otherwise known as UNAIDS, but also in terms of how we are holding ourselves and our leaders accountable to the things that they have signed up for. As we all really well know, the community sector holds critical data that may not always be reflected in government reports, particularly with respect to some of the evolving trends, the shifting needs and concerns, or the challenges that are faced by key and vulnerable populations and communities who are at most risk or at most marginalized. So community reporting really helps us to contribute to that holistic understanding of what is happening, not only at a national level at countries, but also at the subnational or local context within each country. Shana, next slide, please. So the 2016 political declaration on ending AIDS focuses really on the 5-year period ending in 2021, which is of course where we situate ourselves today. But over the longer term, it also covers the period of the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, which take us right through to 2030, and the integration of the global HIV response into that broader sustainable development agenda. So within the broader sustainable development agenda, or sometimes also known as the 2030 goals or the global goals to meet 2030, HIV is within SDG 3, so the third sustainable development goal. And it is within that very lengthy goal, which focuses on health and well-being for all, are the targets towards HIV. But aside from SDG 3, there are several goals across the 16 or 17 that there are that directly or indirectly link to HIV. The 2021 Global AIDS Monitoring report or the Global AIDS Monitoring writ large, is really the 5th year towards our reporting on how we are doing in meeting those sustainable development goals. It's also the 5th and final year of reporting on the UNAIDS HIV monitoring framework, which was for the 5-year period of 2016 with the launch of the 2016 political declaration until 2021. Next slide, please. So, in terms of the importance of 2020 data, and this is where we're going to start drilling into some of the Canadian elements, the reporting in 2021, which of course is going to report on 2020 data, will be the last round of data gathering under the mandate of the 2016 political declaration. So this is going to represent a really important milestone in the global AIDS response, looking back at how we did in meeting the 2020 targets, how we are preparing for and ready to meet the new targets that are being set for 2025, and towards the ending of the HIV epidemic as a public health threat by 2030, which of course is the Sustainable Development Goal under SDG 3. Measuring progress, of course, is crucial for reaching the SDGs and keeping all stakeholders, whether it is government, non-governmental, private sector, faith-based, whoever it might be, accountable towards the global commitments and targets that we have jointly endorsed and jointly made. Next slide, please. So in terms of Canada's reporting commitment. So Canada joined other member states at the UN General Assembly in supporting the adoption of the 2016 Political Declaration, and is committed to providing regular progress reports on Canada's progress to meet those global targets and commitments. Canada, as a sidebar note, was extremely strong in its representation in those discussions. And we have here with us today both Trevor Stratton and Christian Hui, who were part of and highly engaged in those conversations together with the Canadian delegation as they participated in and as part of the delegation in the on the actual floor of the United Nations. As in previous years, the Public Health Agency of Canada is responsible for submitting a Government of Canada report to UNAIDS and following the detailed guidelines that have been outlined by UNAIDS. But every 2 years, there is a second part of that report that is asked for by UNAIDS, and that is the civil society report. So as part of the reporting process, UNAIDS asks that each country's reporting include two main components. The first component is reporting on indicators. The second component is reporting against what is called the NCPI, which means the National Commitments and Policy Instrument. So if we're going back to look at what the first component is, reporting on indicators, these are indicators that have been established by UNAIDS to measure progress against the 10 global commitments that are outlined in the political declaration. And for each of those 10 commitments, there are between 5 and 18 indicators that each country is asked to report on regularly on an annual basis. So Canada reports on these indicators primarily using its data from the Public Health Agency's surveillance systems and national estimates. Each year, UNAIDS really only seeks to bring in or to gather new information that hasn't been reported on in previous years. The second part of that, as I mentioned, is reporting against the National Commitments and Policy Instrument, otherwise known as the NCPI. And the NCPI seeks information on existing policies, on strategies, on laws related to HIV, including in areas such as testing, treatment, viral load prevention, and stigma and discrimination. And it really aims to support countries in identifying where their structural barriers exist, where the gaps exist, and how there might be facilitators to help strengthen their local response. So the NCPI includes two parts. One is for the completion by the national authorities, so the Public Health Agency of Canada, and one is for civil society. It's to be completed and submitted as part of each country's global AIDS monitoring report, which happens once every 2 years, as we've talked about. And the timeline really reflects the consideration that why every 2 years? Because it reflects the acknowledgement that change to policies and laws really take an awful lot of time. And so realizing that likely it's more effective to have this report on every 2 years. So countries are encouraged to submit a narrative report when submitting their global AIDS monitoring report. The online tool that UNAIDS provides incorporates a template that we can use for creating a narrative report. And it consists of a brief narrative summary for each fast track commitment. And then countries can also submit a recent national epidemiological or response overview report if that happens to be available. Then what happens is that UNAIDS pulls it all together and will publish both the narrative report with the approval of each country, and it has it listed on its website. So anyone who's interested can go on to the UNAIDS website and find all of the previous reports. UNAIDS generally will accept shadow reports, but they're not intended to be really parallel reporting processes for civil society and communities. Wherever possible, UNAIDS really encourages that civil society and communities report together and into a national reporting process to really try to help gel the partnerships between government and non-governmental sectors. But governments, you know, it strongly felt that civil society and communities were not adequately included in some areas of national reporting processes. And so in these circumstances, shadow reports would be well received. The data provided by governments might differ considerably from the data collected by civil society and communities while monitoring government progress in delivering these services. This might be another example of when we, UNAIDS, would accept a civil society shadow report. This year, what we're talking about right now for Canada's report is not creating a shadow report. We are completing the second component of the NCPI. So completing the second civil society report that feeds into the government's report. Next slide, please. All right, so now a little bit more detail on the NCPI. So policy monitoring has always been a key component of the global AIDS reporting, all the way back dating to 2003. And it has been implemented essentially every 2 years, most recently in 2020 through the interim national commitments and policy instrument, and in 2019 through the full NCPI. The NCPI is an integral component of the Global AIDS Monitoring Initiative that really aims to measure progress in developing and implementing policies and strategies and laws related to the HIV response. And it does this by doing the following. First, really promoting consultation and dialogue between key stakeholders at the national level, especially government and civil society and communities, in order to be able to capture their perspectives on the different elements of what's working and what's not in the HIV response. It also supports countries in assessing the status of their HIV epidemic and their response, and identifying barriers, gaps, and facilitators to strengthen the response. And then also collecting data on the policy and legal environments and how those are shifting related to HIV. The NCPI has two parts, as we've mentioned. Part A is to be completed by the national authorities. And as we've mentioned, Part B is to be completed by civil society and communities and other non-governmental partners who are involved in the national AIDS response, such as our research community. So the questions in the NCPI are structured around the 10 fast-track commitments and expanded targets to end AIDS by 2030. And I think my final slide before handing it back over to Shana is the role of civil society. And this is where it comes to the really critical piece, particularly given the discussion that we were just having together here as we were beginning today's webinar, with the announcement by UNAIDS today that there will be another high-level meeting on HIV in June, at the very beginning of June, I think June 8th to the 10th in New York, and recognizing the impacts of COVID as an example, and the emerging Ebola epidemic again, or the re-emerging Ebola epidemic in many countries in Africa, the impact that these epidemics have had on HIV services and community-led interventions is quite significant and really needs to be the driver of the next political agenda. So the involvement of civil society in the national consultation is absolutely critical, especially when we're responding to questions related to laws and policies and to these emerging trends that we've just mentioned here with other synergistic pandemics. The community sector also holds much of the critical information and data to a country's response to HIV. And in many areas of the world, community-related research and data is not necessarily always seen as a validated source of information. And this is an amazing and very powerful tool to be able to elevate community-led research and data to national levels. With support and buy-in from the community and civil society through GAM reporting processes, nations can continue to fight and strive for the needs of the 10-10-10 that are continually left out of the targeted goals and discussions within the UNAIDS worldwide strategy of 90-90-90, the treatment cascade. Community groups can bring to the table relevant and updated information that will present a more realistic, nuanced, and real-time picture of the epidemic and all of its diversity and complexity in terms of needs, directions, and priorities. So with that, I hand it over to Shayna and look forward to our conversation together today. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Robin. Are there any questions for Robin before we carry on?
Just a quick question. Can you remind me, is it every 2 years that the GAM reporting happens?
It's every year, but the civil society component is every 2 years.
Okay, that's why I remember 2 years. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Great. Okay, so now we are going to move into talking a little bit more in depth about the survey itself, so that you know what you're getting yourself into. The survey that we will be asking you to complete is primarily made up of this NCPI Part B that Robin's been mentioning. So the survey will be confidential and available in both English and French, and can be anonymous if you choose, although we will provide the option of sharing contact information for any follow-up questions. So the survey will have 57 mostly close-ended questions that are part of the NCPI Part B. And those are, as Robin mentioned, organized based on the 10 commitments from the 2016 political declaration. And some sections are quite long, while other sections have maybe just 1 or 2 questions. And we will also have a section at the end of the survey where we will ask additional questions that are not part of the NCPI Part B. And in a couple of moments, we will be seeking your input for this section. So just a couple of guidelines to go over to help you when you're completing the survey. The 57 questions that are part of the NCPI Part B are directly from UNAIDS. So we haven't changed these at all. And so some of the questions are not quite relevant for Canada. They're the same questions for every country. So you might find that they're irrelevant to the Canadian context. You can skip those questions if you don't think they're relevant. You will also find that a lot of questions refer to in your country. But some of you may be working not at a national level, and that's okay. You can respond based on where you do work, whether it's a local or provincial or territorial level, and that's fine too. Some questions have an I don't know option, but some don't. If you don't know, it's completely fine to skip several questions. You can skip an entire section. We'd really like you to focus on your areas of expertise, while understanding that you're not going to be able to answer all 57 questions, and that's not a problem. At the beginning of each section of the survey, you'll notice that where relevant, there are some UNAIDS definitions, for example, terms like participation or grave human rights abuses. And so you can refer to those as necessary for that section. So as mentioned, the survey is divided between 8 sections of the UNAIDS fast track commitments, and then also the expanded targets are also included where relevant. So we first have the first commitment to ensure that 30 million people living with HIV have access to treatment through meeting the 90-90-90 targets by 2020. The second commitment to eliminate new HIV infections among children by 2020 while ensuring that 1.6 million children have access to HIV treatment by 2018. And in number 3, ensure access to combination prevention options, including pre-exposure prophylaxis, voluntary medical male circumcision, harm reduction and condoms to at least 90% of people by 2020, especially young women and adolescent girls in high prevalence countries and key populations, gay men and other men who have sex with men, transgender people, sex workers and their clients, people who inject drugs, and prisoners. And then under this section on commitment 3, there are questions related to law enforcement, legal protection of key populations, HIV prevention services for people who inject drugs, HIV services in prisons, participation, and pre-exposure prophylaxis. And, oh, sorry, missed a few. Commitment number 4 is to eliminate gender inequalities and end all forms of violence and discrimination against women and girls and people living with HIV and key populations by 2020. And number 5, to ensure that 90% of young people have the skills, knowledge, and capacity to protect themselves from HIV and have access to sexual and reproductive health services by 2020 in order to reduce the number of new HIV infections among adolescent girls and young women to below 100,000 per year. And number 6, to ensure that 75% of people living with, at risk of, and affected by HIV benefit from HIV-sensitive social protection by 2020. Number 7, to ensure that at least 30% of all service delivery is community-led by 2020. And skipping to number 9, empower people living with, at risk of, and affected by HIV to know their rights and to access justice and legal services to prevent and challenge violations of human rights. And under commitment 9, there are sections on rights literacy and accountability mechanisms. And you'll notice that there are no questions for commitments 8 and 10. Commitment number 10 is included in the NCPI Part A, which is completed by PHAC, but commitment number 8 is not. Just to show you a couple of example questions so you get a sense of what they might look like. So as an example, from commitment number 3, the subsection on law enforcement, can possession of a needle syringe without a prescription be used as evidence of drug use or cause for arrest in your country? And your options are yes and no. And then have transgender people in your country been arrested or prosecuted for manifestations of their gender identity in the past 3 years? And this one has yes, no, and don't know. So there doesn't really seem to be any consistent reason why some have the don't know option. But as mentioned, you can skip when you don't know. And then some questions like this one have a few other options and a little bit more room where you can add some description. So from commitment number 9, subsection on accountability and accountability mechanisms, does your country have mechanisms in place for accessing affordable legal services? Please select all that apply. Yes, legal aid systems applicable to HIV casework. Yes, pro bono legal services provided by private law firms or individual lawyers. Yes, legal services provided by university-based legal clinics. Yes, community paralegals. Yes, other, and then you can describe, and no. So those are some of the types of questions. And then you can see the full set of sections at this link from starting at page 180. I think you all should have also received the set of questions from me yesterday to hopefully have a quick peek at. And so we really just wanted to take this opportunity to open it up and hear from all of you as to what other questions should we add to make sure that we are capturing the full picture of the Canadian context. So I'm going to stop sharing now and open it up to everyone to hear from you. If you had a chance to look at it, what do you think is missing? If you want to just take a quick scan through it now, that's fine too. You can give us either specific questions or any just general thematic areas that would be helpful? Robin?
Thanks, Shayna. That was really super helpful. I think the only thing that I just wanted to re-emphasize is that we are at an important moment in the history of the epidemic, not only because we're coming up to 40 years, but because this particular moment for reporting is really going to help set a baseline for the political declaration that we're going to be developing over the next coming weeks and months as we move into June's high-level meeting on HIV. And so I think, you know, having some additional questions not only helps best prepare us for the conversations with the Canadian government, but also with other governments within those UN spaces, but also really helps us to identify where the gaps are, knowing just how devastating COVID has been in terms of disruptions to current HIV-related services across the country and in our very diverse different geographies and contexts. Thanks.
Sam?
One thing that I was wondering is a lot of these questions are framed as very factual questions. There is actually a right answer to them. You know, the fact that there is arrests for people possessing syringes, for example, as a criminal code offense. There's actually a factual answer to that. So what do we, I'm always confused by this tool. What do we do about people who answer the question wrong? And is it just an indicator of how well people know our context versus what the reality is? So I find that confusing. And I know I'm probably going to steal Trevor's point, but Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples are not identified as a key population. So that is a set of questions I wonder if we should add. And if we do add questions around that, what would we ask?
Mm-hmm.
Will be suitable for 2 months, and beyond that,
so just before handing it over to Trevor, I think in response to your first question, a couple of the key things are to continue to emphasize with people that if you don't know the answer, you can skip the questions, and then also to try and reach a high number of people so that any incorrect answers are balanced out by hopefully more correct answers. And then also to target groups that are experts in each of these areas so that, and hopefully if they identify themselves and we can recognize that they are the experts in that area, we can have a better sense of which are the factually based responses and which might be guesses. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else we can do to.
But what do you think is the point of asking people factual questions?
Oh, what do I?
Yeah.
So my guess is that it's if your government is not responding correct, like factually to factual questions, and civil society has an entirely different response, then that would highlight that. But I don't know if there are any other reasons why.
Yeah.
I think the information is actually really interesting in terms of, and for civil societies to note where there are the tensions, right? Where there are the disconnects between the right answer and the wrong answer, because then it is, you know, it is information about why we need broad scale information campaigns, right? To know your rights about things. So if providers of HIV related services are unsure about, for example, whether or not holding a syringe is a criminal offense, then, you know, it shows where there is an information gap and where we need to pull up our socks.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Trevor.
Yeah, I think that, you know, listening to the train of thought going makes me think we could be asking, you know, looking outside of Canada's context, are Indigenous peoples recognized as an entity by the member state or by a country? Because there's many countries that have huge numbers of indigenous peoples and they don't recognize them. They're not recognized anywhere in law. So there's no special provisions for indigenous. But I also noticed, and then, you know, there's no questions around racism, it seems. It seems like UNAIDS, even though there is a convention about racism by the UN, and they're resistant to using racism, and that it comes out once in a while. But member states themselves don't use that word. It's the UN that throws the word in, and then they get lots of reactions. So, you know, so the question could be, are indigenous peoples are indigenous peoples recognized in your country? No, we don't have any. You know, and then compare that to the United Nations Permanent Forum that lists indigenous peoples around the world, so they're not recognized. Oh, this country, Germany, doesn't have any that are identified, so that's a cool answer for them. But if Bolivia answers that way, that's a huge red flag. And questions around racism, because we call them ethnic minorities, and we're buried under ethnic minorities, but we need to be named, or we will not be seen. And you know, it's not just about Canada, but I mean, what about systemic racism? Is there systemic racism that could prevent immigrants and indigenous people? Something where ethnic minorities, indigenous, and make a list, and so that they're named. You know, disability, did that come up? I think, I don't know if it did or not, but I did a search for a number of words, and I didn't find it. So yeah, disability is not in there. Oh yeah, it is. There's one, but it's, you know, that's where they're in a laundry list, like number 43. Regardless of gender, nationality, age, disability, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, religion, language, and it goes on. We're in a laundry list, right? And we're not even named in the laundry list, which is in the last political declaration, we got 2 mentions for indigenous, but they were in those laundry lists. So there's no measurable targets. And I have more questions later about creating the next GAM so that we have those questions in there. How can we pressure? Because after the PD comes out, the political declaration, then they make the GAM, right? They build the GAM and the indicators. And so there's a lot more work after the PD is published. That's what I had to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Tara. Robin, is that a residual hand or
No, it's not a hanging hand, it's a new hand. But I totally agree with everything that Trevor has said. And I think we really need to include all of those elements within our survey instrument and within our civil society report. And it needs to be a critical contribution from Canadian civil society and community to the new political declaration. And of course, all of the real work that comes afterwards as we're creating the monitoring and accountability tools afterwards. So yeah, fully agree. The other piece that I was going to suggest, because I don't see, and perhaps I've just missed it, any kind of critical assessment around GPA and MIPA in the tools. And I think they often have become tokenized catchphrases rather than really accelerating and advancing not only within our own sector, but within our society writ large, the greater and more meaningful engagement of people living with HIV. And so in order to be able to do anything about it, it would be great. And I know there are stigma indexes and there is work going around it, but this is a global monitoring tool. So it is an opportunity for us to have critical reflection as we're reflecting on all of the other critical elements of a comprehensive HIV response. And GPA-MIPA needs to be in there so that we can really push that agenda forward for all key and vulnerable populations. Thanks.
anything else that Christian?
Yeah, I just want to, like, first of all, say I echo with all the suggestions that have been made already. And Robin, thanks for, speaking up about GPA. That's really much appreciated. from a person living with HIV standpoint, it's great to have allies like you who actually take note of these issues. I think one of the things I noted, and I'm just proposing, it kind of follows up with the thought that Trevor was speaking on in terms of, addressing systemic racism or, indigenous rights or rights of migrants or whatnot. So I know, the Public Health Agency of Canada, they ascribe to the accelerating STBPI framework. And one of the concepts that they ascribe to, or the values they ascribe to, is health equity. And I think sometimes, my sense is maybe racism is not always it doesn't necessarily always stand out within the global context, is, depending on which, area or countries you're in, racism may or may not be as prominent. But, I think if we are able to see, is there a way for us to kind of assess whether there is actually health equity that is existing within the country? Because that is something that can be applied to the needs of key populations as well, right? And, given the, I guess, more conservative leaning political environment, I don't know if, sometimes these different use of terms may actually help us push forward some of the, kind of community priorities that certain countries are actually not necessarily often supporting. Like, so in terms of the rights of people who use drugs, let's say, I think, I was just looking at the questions, and I would just say, they don't really ask about harm reduction services there. But at the same time, I can understand why, because I know certain countries, they really opposed to it. Within the Canadian context, is very important. So yeah, and that kind of led me to thinking, perhaps maybe, asking something about health equity may actually help us assess how we're doing in terms of prevention, treatment, kind of retention in services, etc. If we look at, PrEP uptake rate, I can say there's not equity there, really. We know which group benefits and which group are still waiting to get access to these services. So that's something I'm just proposing for the team to consider.
Thanks, Christian. Those are all really helpful. Trevor?
I don't know why I have to be retrained every time I take a break from Zoom to find that stupid hand, but yeah, one thing I'm thinking about as a vehicle, as a way to get toward what, key populations, working with ethnic minorities and racism, I'm wondering if the concept, we used to call it, culturally appropriate services. I don't know if that's a concept. Is that a global concept, or now we're calling it cultural safety, which I think actually is more appropriate, because how can you be culturally competent if you're not from the culture? That you can learn about it and be more, know more about it, and make a space safe for those from other cultures, especially minority cultures from the dominant culture in a country, in a given country. And maybe that's something that could be under the harm reduction number 3 area, the large area on number 3, which includes key populations. And is that where I saw the harm reduction? It seems to me like culture safety and reducing harm are the same things, right? Making things safe and reducing harm are the same things. Yeah, number 3 there. It seems like it would fit under a category like that. And people need that. And cultural safety goes beyond ethnic culture, ethnicity or cultures. It's like drug culture, or there's different cultures for different drugs, for example. That's why you don't have one addictions program called AA, you have NA, you have all these A's, it's everything, you know, because it's different. I'm just thinking about that may be a way to sort of a half measure to get toward Indigenous, because it's a hard fight, you know, we have to be strategic.
That makes sense. Anything else? I was wondering, so there are a lot of questions about the criminalization of different behaviors around drug use and gender, but there's nothing that seems explicitly to ask about criminalization of HIV transmission. Is that something that you think we should be adding?
Totally. Yeah. Because
Yeah,
it's still
especially
taking
since
place.
Canada really shines in that area.
Yeah, do your laws follow the science, or is it all about philosophy and stigma?
Any other questions that we should add, or areas of questions that we should be thinking about?
I can't remember if we've actually talked about this already, but have we included or talked about any COVID specific questions around service disruptions or new intersectionalities of stigma as for key and vulnerable populations as a result of COVID?
No, we haven't. There's nothing in there about COVID, and there's nothing, we haven't talked about COVID for the
And
first
then the
time
other,
ever. We haven't talked about COVID.
the other piece might be, and I'm not sure if it's in there already, is around comorbidities. So I don't think we can really fully comprehensively talk about HIV when we don't talk about comorbidities like TB or hepatitis. So just, I'm not sure if it's in there, if anyone has seen it in there.
So
That it's particularly acute for our newcomer refugee populations and our Indigenous communities in Canada. Completely relevant.
So the fast track commitment number 10 that is included in Part A but not Part B includes mention of TB, cervical cancer, and hepatitis B and C. But so there's no questions about those in Part B, and then I don't really know the rationale for not.
So we might want to take a look at some of those more qualifying questions in terms of looking at the silos and service access potentially, continuity of care. So take a look at the questions that are being asked in the Part A and what is not being asked in the Part A, so that we ask those unspoken questions in Part B.
I totally support that. And, you know, especially the TB thing. TB is the #1 global killer of people living with HIV. Why aren't they asking civil society about it? And look at Canada's statistics around TB. It's pathetic. It's worse than HIV. We can't get statistics on our communities around TB, and yet where apparently it's being stored at the public health unit level. It doesn't even go to the provinces, so the provinces can't forward it to the feds. But
and just the vulnerabilities that people have with TB to COVID and the disruptions and the allocation of resources. I mean, testing is using the gene expert, right? Which is for diagnosing PB, is also being used for COVID tests. So it's a critical element. I completely agree with you, Trevor. And the fact that it's not is the fact that it's not being represented here is a huge omission.
Yeah, I agree.
This community in particular. So
Kristen?
Yeah, so I guess since we're talking about data, I'm not sure if it was in the questionnaire, but maybe asking a question about collection of disaggregated data. You know, it is very relevant in Canada, especially, you know, not a lot of race-based data that's available, or if they are, then it's not really readily accessible. I would like to see what your folks think about potentially adding a question around U equals U. I know at the last cocktail hours, we had a discussion around it, but you know, Canada actually officially signed on to U equals U as a country. I'm actually not sure if any other countries in the world have officially signed on to it. I think there might be a few, but and it is a pretty strong community-led movement. UNAIDS supports it to some extent. I don't think it has been thoroughly, you know, exploited to its maximum potential to ensure that people can access, you know, maximum treatment uptake from that angle. So yeah, I think it might be good to just assess how has this information be uptaken by the community overall?
Thanks, Christian.
Where did I see? Was it? I think in the Lancet. They just recently released a series of papers on U equals U, which I found was very interesting from the Lancet. You know, so if the Lancet's doing it, UNAIDS should have it in there. Come on.
Great, thanks. Last call. Anybody have any other additions?
Is there anything on injectables? Because they're going to roll out soon.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think PrEP is the only focus of prevention option.
Yeah.
One of the, you know, kind of community conversations that have been happening for a while is whether the needs of aging people living in HIV are met. So I don't know if it's included in the survey, but that seems to be, you know, aside from the youth and, you know, children, adolescents, you know, obviously there are priority population groups as well, but I think the opposite end is also something that is worthwhile to look at, especially people living longer and, you know, the services might not be as readily you know, accessible.
Thanks, Christian. Okay, well, I think that gives us lots to work with in terms of creating some additional questions and filling in. Oh, yeah, Trevor.
One more thing around in the last PD, I see the question here on 30% of all service delivery is community led by 2020, but they don't, nowhere is it mentioned about the 6% for advocacy. Remember that? I wonder if we're going to see that come through in the next PD, or if we should be asking civil society that question, because it may be different than the government's answer.
For sure. For advocacy, civil society, community advocacy, absolutely. So I know that there are a number of different, that ICAD's a part of, a number of different campaigns globally reaching out to donor countries to support HIV community and civil society advocacy, because it's not well represented within the declaration.
Mm-hmm. And remember, were you there, Robin? I can't remember when Harper was still in government, and they didn't even contact civil society around Part B, and we did it anyway. We did the shadow report or something.
Yeah, it was actually, I think it was Nikki and ICAD who led that together, and it was the shadow report in that instance. Yeah. The other thing that we might want to take a look at, particularly in the Canadian context, and a lot of the work about financing Canada's community response and the protected envelope of funding, is relating it back to the political declaration and the percentage that is supposed to be the target for funding that is to go to the community response. And just to see where Canada aligns on that, because I know that a number of organizations in countries around the world struggle with that and fall far below the 25% for HIV prevention. But I think it's also it's 6%, I believe, of funds to national responses or to go to the community response, as not the floor, not the ceiling, but the floor, right? So at least 6%. It's not saying up to 6%.
Mhm.
What are some of the kind of community advocacy discussions that you're aware of related to the upcoming high-level meeting that you may be aware of? I'm just wondering.
So we know that the call for proposals for a civil society platform or an organization to host the platform for global civil society engagement around the political declaration has just been sent out. And so it's very rushed. The deadline for submissions is next week. It's March 3rd. And really by now there's usually a zero draft, isn't there, Trevor? Last time there was a zero draft as we were going into the April civil society session at the UN.
No, I don't think there was, because
Oh,
I
no,
remember,
it came
no,
out afterwards.
yeah, because I remember everybody was like, especially people that are new to the process, they see the civil society declaration or whatever we call it, and everyone's like, yes, we cheer. And then when we see the zero draft, we go, oh my God, where is all
Where
of
did
our
everything
stuff?
go?
Yeah.
Exactly. Where did everything go? So yeah, so you're right. You're right. So really, there hasn't been an awful lot of talk about, at least in the conversations that I've been in. Trevor and Christian and San and Catherine, I'm not sure about the rooms that you've been in, but they're really in the rooms that I've been in, there hasn't been an awful lot. The focus has more been on the strategy development processes that are going on within these multilateral organizations that work on the issue of HIV and the target setting. So now the real work actually happens. And I think this GAM reporting, particularly for Canadian civil society, to be at the forefront of really advocating for ambition in the next political declaration, as opposed to retraction, as we see a number of conservative governments taking hold, is going to be absolutely critical. And so hopefully what we can do is use this report as Canadian civil society to really ground our advocacy messages, not only for our own Canadian government to take forward in their advocacy campaigns at the negotiating tables as a member state, but also in terms of messaging that we can share with other like-minded organizations and other civil society movements around the world.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Robin.
The fight's going to be extensive. So, for example, in the conversations at the Global Fund,
Mm-hmm.
and also conversations at UNAIDS around the strategy, the concern is, and around G7 and G20 tables, is that number one, as a plus, governments around the world are now seeing, if they hadn't already seen it, the critical value of investing in health systems, right? Health systems also including community systems, because without those, then your workforce is gone. And as we've seen with COVID, it's disaster, right? The downside is that HIV is really even further on the margins, because all governments are thinking now about COVID. And so in terms of domestic resource mobilization with low and middle income countries, and in terms of overseas development assistance or official development assistance of donor countries, the context is changing so rapidly, where donor countries are focusing, there are more domestic strategies and nationalistic policies being put in place so that countries focus inwards on their own COVID responses. And also overseas or official development assistance, ODA, the threat, and we've seen this in a couple of countries, is going to decrease in order to offset the national debt that has happened as a result of COVID safety nets that have been put in place by countries like Canada for their populations. And so what this means in terms of countries and donor countries' ability and fiscal space to be able to allocate resources to an HIV response, whether it's at home and or contributions abroad, is going to be significantly impacted. And so this political declaration, I really anticipate that there is going to be a lot of pushback by governments around the world, really around the funding commitments in particular.
Mm-hmm. Just a follow-up question. Has the, given that UNAIDS was engaging in the community consultations for the 2021 to 26 strategy, has that been approved? Or how does that play out, or the draft strategy play out in relations to the HLM?
Mm-hmm. So Trevor might have a little bit more information given his past role on the NGO delegation to the PCB. But my understanding of it is that it has been sequential. So there have been a number of progressive iterations, and that it is to come to the PCB in March for finalization and sign off. And the reason why they wanted it in March is so that it wasn't going to intersect with the political declaration and the high level meeting. And so as we saw in 2016, the UNAIDS strategy development process was critical in order for us to be able to achieve big wins on issues like sexual reproductive health and rights, on gender, on IP issues around intellectual property rights and things like that. And so what we really don't want to happen is in that the new strategy, or the extension of the strategy is what they're calling it, is not a retraction on any of that language, so that it sets the stage for the new declaration.
Yeah, you're right that the UNAIDS strategy, I would argue that that's probably the most influential of the three documents that feed in. Yeah. One is the report from the UN SC, the Secretary General. Yes. UNSG writes a report as well, and then there's the civil society declaration as well. Those three documents go in, but it's the UNAIDS one that has the biggest clout because they agreed on it. It's not civil society. It's not some guy doing it on his own with a bunch of UN employees. It's actually agreements and language that went through the UNAIDS PCB. Yeah. But we're going to have, we're going to lose more. That's all the words I'm getting is that we're going to lose ground this year. Yeah. So we have to fight hard. And that means working with governments, because it's not the United Civil Society, it's United Nations, it's nation states that make the language. So we're going to have to lobby governments and find our friends and create some language and say, listen, we're sending this piece of language out to everybody. Can you get on board with this? Can you create a coalition and fight for this? Yeah. Because that's the only way to do it. Us standing up, when you get to, how it is, when you get to the HLM, there's probably going to be a silence procedure on the zero draft. Oh yeah. So you get there, they vote on it, and then you have 3 days of blah, blah, blah. Who cares?
After discussions, yeah.
What's interesting though is the comments that the countries make. It's really good to have a rapporteur there to record what each country says they're interested in or what they do or do not support, and then hold them accountable to what they said at the UN. That's a good way too, because a lot of times they go beyond. Individual countries say things that we can kind of say, hey, in front of everybody, you said this, and it's in the minutes, so do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The other piece we have to be thinking about, and just jumping off from Trevor's point about the fight that we have, is that with the rise of conservative governments, and yes, this is a member state driven process, this is a UN member state driven process, that not all member states are friendly towards civil society, right? And as we've seen that recently within the UNAIDS structure, where there has been a tussle about the rights of civil society and communities to participate in UNAIDS, discussions. And it's only within UNAIDS that there is the civil society or the NGO delegation. Other UN bodies don't have that in their governing structures. So we do see a shrinking space of civil society, particularly in the era of COVID, where already criminalized populations are even increasingly criminalized as scapegoated for people who transmit COVID. So totally not evidence, but anyways, the fight is going to be massive.
Well, you and I both know AIDS activists in Russia that had to get the hell out of town because they were being persecuted back home.
Absolutely.
And to continue, they had to go to Ukraine or somewhere else.
Yeah, it's absolutely, and have to relocate.
Yesterday was the meeting of the UNAIDS Expert Advisory Committee on Evaluation that I'm a member of.
Yeah.
And yeah, we had some really interesting discussions about the impacts of COVID on evaluation in particular. Like obviously people can no longer, there's no opportunities for in-person engagement to observe programs actually happening. It all has to be done at a very arm's length way, and there's no opportunity for community engagement, you know, gathering people in a focus group, for example. All that kind of methodology is really jeopardized. But we also talked about bigger systems issues, like all the fake news, you know, in Brazil, for example, and I'm sure in many other jurisdictions, and just the misinformation campaigns in a lot of countries, the digital divide, you know.
Oh,
people,
definitely.
Right, not having access to the technologies,
Yeah.
unemployment, overdose crisis, gender-based violence, ramping up through COVID, and then, you know, all the lessons learned around, you know, from HIV treatment rollout, the inequities is now in some ways being replicated with COVID vaccine rollout. Yeah, so it was an interesting, rich discussion about the parallels and the crossovers between COVID and HIV. That just reminds me, did the survey doesn't really talk about overdose crisis, does it? I guess that's a bit beyond the scope of the HIV indicators.
It
Not-
activates in naloxone, I see, you know, but not necessarily, I mean, the wording is not, you know, address the overdose crisis. That's
yeah. Okay.
So San, is that advisory group that you're part of, the Monitoring and Evaluation Advisory Group to UNAIDS, is it going to be the one that's going to spearhead the new development of the GAM?
We didn't talk about that, but now that I've had this meeting, I'm going to ask them that, because I don't know if they've been involved, as this advisory group's only a year and a bit old.
Yeah.
So I don't think we weren't in place when this was formulated 2 years ago. So I can definitely ask that. It would be good if we were, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Reminds me, I meant to send you a resource that we've developed about community-led monitoring.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Actually, you know, I think that's really important, the online thing, because the two issues you mentioned, this is access to the internet is becoming a human right now.
Absolutely.
It has to be a human right, otherwise people are screwed. But then once you get on there, there's an infodemic happening on there.
Yeah.
You know, alongside the pandemic, and if all your information is coming from online, then what are the strategies there? What are people doing around that? Like that's how do we fit that in there?
Yeah, the blocking, you know, the power that countries have to block certain access to, you know, web information. It's kind of scary.
And are there questions around, I mean, for part B in the GAM, it seems like activism there should be a question around activism, especially now. It's changed. Like how can we be activists now? We sign petitions, send letters. That's all we can do. We used to be able, like in Mexico for the IAS conference, we stormed the stage and unfurled a giant banner and read out our list of demands, you know, and there was a civil society liaison they had there that we worked with. So they timed it. So they said, if you do it at the time, if we can agree on a time so that we're ready for it, we'll support you in doing this. So they had the camera on us on the big screen. They left the microphone on, they turned the lights on, and they notified the media. So the media all came in, and we made the front page of the Mexico newspapers, the Mexico City newspapers the next day. I don't see any of that anymore. How do you do activism now? I don't get it.
Yeah, really, I think that's a really interesting question.
How do you measure it too?
Great. Well, just conscious of time here, and that we just have a couple of minutes left. So thank you all so much. That was a really helpful and rich conversation, and will really help us with formulating some questions to add to the survey. Just in terms of next steps, so we will work with this conversation, and we will also be meeting with the steering committee on Monday to get some further input and feedback on additional questions, and then we'll add those into the survey. Robin, you look like you have something to say.
Oh, do I?
Oh, no, you don't. Okay. You had your.
I guess the only question, and you're probably just about to ask it, is if folks on today's call would be interested in reviewing the questions that are developed.
Sure.
Definitely, absolutely. I would love that. In fact, I'm hoping to get involved somehow through the UNAIDS PCB if they have some sort of a civil society working group on creating the GAM, because I know they have a working group in the NGO delegation. So there may be a way to engage there. I'm gonna be bugging them as well.
Great.
And they may be able to give us a list of some of the contacts of friendly countries that are going to be sending delegations to New York for the HLM. So I'll share that. Let's share if we get contacts, we'll share them around.
That's great.
Yeah, excellent.
Early mobilization around the HLM. I love
Yeah,
it.
well, it's going to happen like that, so we better be ready.
That's right.
So we will share questions with you for your feedback. It will be on a fairly quick turnaround, as we are trying to get the survey out next week, midweek, hopefully, because PHAC needs to submit its report on March 31st. So we have a tight timeline here.
It fits perfectly in my work plan, so I'll definitely make time for that.
Maybe you can also ask PHAC what their plans are in terms of engaging the civil society on their delegations this time around, if they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Happy to start that conversation.
Another piece of work that we will ask for your support in is to help us get the survey out within your networks, and do some targeted outreach where you think folks might have specific expertise to contribute for different sections of the report, or of the survey, sorry. So we will share that link with you for the survey sometime next week. Right now we're looking at a deadline probably of Friday, March 12th, but we'll adjust that as necessary as this rolls out. And then, as mentioned, we will provide a space for people to leave their contact information so that we can follow up afterwards as needed. And then we will prepare a draft report to be reviewed by the steering committee, and we'll be presenting the report at another webinar, which is right now scheduled for March 25th, at the same time as today's webinar, and you can sign up for that at the same link if you haven't already, and we can share that link again with you. And then we will be submitting the final report to PHAC for them to submit their own reporting at the end of March, and the report will also be translated to French. So that brings us to the end of our session. If you have any questions that come up, or any other areas of questioning that pop into your mind, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, are there any final thoughts or questions before we say goodbye?
Thank you, ICAD, for your amazing work, as always.
Oh,
Thanks,
thanks,
Christian, but thank you, Sheena.
And thanks, Catherine, for chairing the steering committee. We haven't met yet, but hopefully. And Stan, thank you for always being there. And thanks, Trevor.
Yeah, good to see everybody.
Yeah.
And
Nice to see
keep
you.
up the good work. Always like to work with ICAD.
Aww.
Hey, we need you.
Well, we've got lots of time and work on our hands ahead of us. So we will be talking very soon, likely next week.
Okay, see you guys.
Have a great
Thanks.
day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.